Venezuela forces a global recalculation. Let me take you back to the morning of January 10, 2024, a date that, at first glance, seemed like just another routine diplomatic flare-up in a region the world has long since learned to ignore. Nicolas Maduro, standing before a crowd of loyalists in Caracas, announced that Venezuela would formally annex the Essequibo region, a 160,000 square kilometer swath of jungle and oil-rich territory that Guyana has administered for over a century. The declaration was met with predictable outrage from Washington, London, and Brussels, who condemned it as a brazen violation of international law. The UN Security Council convened in emergency session. The U.S. Southern Command scrambled fighter jets to Guyana's airspace. The New York Times ran an editorial calling it a test of the rules-based order. And for most observers, that's where the story ended, a minor crisis in a minor country, resolved by the usual mix of diplomatic posturing and military muscle flexing. But here's what they're not telling: this isn't just about a border dispute. What we're witnessing is the first real stress test of the post-American world order, a moment where the tectonic plates of global power are shifting in ways that will define the next decade. And if you think this is just another Latin American sideshow, you're missing the bigger picture. I've spent the last 30 years studying the intersection of geopolitics, resource competition, and great power rivalry, from the fall of the Soviet Union to the rise of China, from the wars in the Middle East to the scramble for the Arctic. And what I can tell you is Venezuela's move isn't an aberration. It's a symptom. A symptom of a world where the old rules no longer apply, where the US is no longer the sole arbiter of global security, and where smaller nations are increasingly willing to gamble on defiance because they sense that the costs of compliance now outweigh the benefits. This isn't just about Guyana. It's about the future of American hegemony, the resilience of the West's alliances, and whether the 21st century will be defined by multipolar chaos or a new, more dangerous form of great power competition. So let's start with the official narrative, the story they want you to believe. The official, a simple story of aggression and law. According to the Standard account, this is a straightforward case of revisionist aggression. Venezuela, led by the authoritarian Maduro regime, is attempting to seize territory that has been under Guyanese control since the 19th century, when an international tribunal awarded the Essequibo to British Guiana. The 1899 arbitral award, brokered by the US and Britain, was supposed to settle the matter once and for all. But in 1962, Venezuela revived its claim, arguing that the award was fraudulent, a position it has maintained ever since, though without any serious effort to enforce it. Then, in 2015, ExxonMobil discovered massive offshore oil reserves in Guyana's waters, transforming the country from one of the poorest in the hemisphere into a potential petrostate. By 2023, Guyana was producing over 600,000 barrels of oil per day, with projections to hit 1.2 million by 2027. Venezuela, meanwhile, was collapsing under the weight of US sanctions, hyperinflation, and economic mismanagement. Maduro, facing domestic unrest and international isolation, saw an opportunity. In December 2023, he held a referendum in which Venezuelans overwhelmingly voted to reclaim the Essequibo. A month later, he announced the creation of a new Venezuelan state, Guayana Essequiba, and ordered the state oil company, PDVSA, to begin issuing licenses for exploration in the disputed territory. The response from the West was swift and unequivocal. The U.S. State Department called the move unacceptable and reaffirmed its support for Guyana's sovereignty. The UK sent a warship to the region. The OAS condemned Venezuela's actions. The International Court of Justice ruled that Venezuela must refrain from any action that would alter the status quo. And in a show of solidarity, the U.S. Southern Command conducted joint military exercises with Guyana's tiny defense force, including overflights by F-16s and the deployment of a Navy destroyer to Guyanese waters. On the surface, it looks like a classic case of a rogue state overreaching, only to be checked by the combined weight of the international community. The message is the rules-based order still functions, and those who violate it will face consequences. But here's the problem with this: it assumes that the rules-based order is still the primary framework governing international relations. And that assumption is increasingly untenable. What's really happening in the Essequibo? Let's start with the facts that don't fit the official story. First, the timing. Why now? Venezuela has claimed the Essequibo for decades, but it has never made a serious military push to take it. The answer lies in three converging: economic collapse, domestic political pressure, and a shifting global order. Maduro's regime is on life support. The Venezuelan economy has contracted by 75% since 2013. Oil production, which once accounted for 95% of export revenues, has plummeted from 3.5 million barrels per day to barely 700,000. U.S. sanctions have crippled the country's ability to sell oil on global markets, and the regime's only lifeline has been China and Russia, which have provided loans, investment, and diplomatic cover in exchange for access to Venezuela's resources. But even that support has limits. China, in particular, has grown weary of Venezuela's inability to service its debts, and Russia, while happy to poke the U.S. in the eye, has its own financial constraints. So Maduro needed a win. And the Essequibo offered one. The referendum was a masterstroke of domestic propaganda. By framing the dispute as a matter of national honor, Maduro rallied a population that has little else to feel proud about. The vote wasn't just about the Essequibo, it was about legitimacy. And it worked. Polls show that support for Maduro's government, while still low, ticked up in the weeks following the referendum. But here's where it gets interesting. The referendum wasn't just a domestic play. It was also a signal to the great powers. And the great powers heard it loud and clear. Second, the oil. The Essequibo isn't just territory, it's a potential bonanza. The offshore Stabroek Block, where ExxonMobil has made its biggest discoveries, is estimated to hold at least 11 billion barrels of recoverable oil. That's more than the entire proven reserves of Mexico. And that's just one block. The entire Essequibo region, both onshore and offshore, could hold far more. For a country like Venezuela, which sits atop the world's largest proven oil reserves, the Essequibo represents a way to bypass U.S. sanctions and regain access to global energy markets. But here's the U.S. isn't the only player with a stake in this game. China has been quietly investing in Guyana's oil sector, and Russia has been courting both Guyana and Venezuela as part of its broader strategy to extend its influence in the Western Hemisphere. In 2023, Russia's state-owned Rosneft signed a deal with Guyana to explore offshore blocks, and China's CNOOC has a major stake in the Stabroek Block. So when Maduro made his move, he wasn't just challenging Guyana, he was testing the resolve of the U.S. and its allies in a region where their dominance is no longer assured. Third, the legal fiction. The 1899 arbitral award is not as ironclad as the West would have you believe. Venezuela has long argued that the tribunal was rigged, that the British and Americans colluded to deny Venezuela its rightful territory. And while most international lawyers dismiss this claim, there's enough ambiguity in the historical record to give Maduro's narrative some traction. The 1966 Geneva Agreement, which Venezuela signed with the UK and Guyana, explicitly recognized the dispute and called for a negotiated settlement. The ICJ's jurisdiction over the case is itself contested. Venezuela has refused to participate in the proceedings, arguing that the court has no authority to rule on the matter. This isn't to say that Venezuela's claim is legitimate. It's not. But the point is that the legal terrain is far more contested than the official narrative suggests. And in a world where the US and its allies are increasingly selective about which international laws they enforce, that ambiguity matters. Finally, the great power angle. The US response to Venezuela's move has been muscular but cautious. The military exercises with Guyana were designed to send a message, but they were also carefully calibrated to avoid provoking a direct confrontation. Why? Because the US is already stretched thin. The wars in Ukraine and Gaza have drained American resources and attention. The Pentagon's 2022 National Defense Strategy identified China as the pacing threat and Russia as an acute threat, but it also acknowledged that the US can no longer afford to be the world's policeman. And in Latin America, the US is facing a resurgence of left-wing governments, from Mexico to Colombia to Brazil, many of which are wary of American interventionism. So when Maduro made his move, he was betting that the US wouldn't have the bandwidth to respond forcefully. And so far, he's been right. The exited geopolitical a world in transition. To understand why Venezuela's gambit matters, you have to out. We are living through the most significant shift in the global balance of power since the end of the Cold War. The unipolar moment, the brief period after 1991 when the US stood unchallenged as the world's sole superpower, is over. What we're seeing now is the emergence of a multipolar world, where power is diffused among multiple the US, China, Russia, and a handful of rising regional powers like India, Turkey, and Iran. This transition is messy, unpredictable, and dangerous. And Venezuela's move is a perfect example of how smaller nations are navigating this new landscape. Let's start with the US. For decades, American foreign policy has been guided by the doctrine of liberal hegemony, the idea that the US should use its unparalleled power to spread democracy, free markets, and the rules-based order. But that doctrine is now under siege, both at home and abroad. At home, a growing number of Americans are skeptical of foreign entanglements, and both the left and the right are questioning the costs of global leadership. Abroad, the US is facing a crisis of credibility. Its interventions in Iraq, Libya, and Afghanistan have left a trail of instability and resentment. Its alliances are fraying. And its economic model is no longer the only game in town. China, meanwhile, has spent the last 2 decades patiently building an alternative order, one based on state-led capitalism, non-interference in domestic affairs, and a network of infrastructure projects under the Belt and Road Initiative. Beijing doesn't seek to replace the US as the global hegemon. It seeks to create a parallel system where it can operate freely, without being constrained by American rules. And it's making progress. Today, China is the largest trading partner for most of the world's countries, including many US allies. It has established alternative financial institutions, like the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, to rival the IMF and World Bank. And it has forged strategic partnerships with countries that feel marginalized by the West, from Russia to Iran to Venezuela. Russia, for its part, has abandoned any pretense of integrating into the Western order. Under Putin, Russia has pursued a strategy of revisionist resistance, using military force, cyber warfare, and energy leverage to undermine US influence and reassert its sphere of influence in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet space. But Russia's ambitions extend beyond its immediate neighborhood. It sees Latin America as a key battleground in its struggle with the US, and it has been cultivating allies in the region, from Cuba to Nicaragua to Venezuela. This is the context in which Venezuela's move must be understood. Maduro isn't acting in a vacuum. He's acting in a world where the US is no longer the only game in town, where China and Russia are willing to provide alternative sources of support, and where the costs of defiance are lower than they've been in decades. And here's the Maduro isn't the only leader who's noticed. From Nicaragua's Daniel Ortega to Bolivia's Luis Arce to even Brazil's Lula da Silva, left-wing leaders in Latin America are increasingly willing to challenge US dominance. They see that the US is distracted, divided, and declining in relative terms. And they're betting that the future belongs to a multipolar world where they can play the great powers off against each other. This isn't just about ideology. It's about power. And the power dynamics in Latin America are shifting in ways that should worry Washington. Military and strategic, the illusion of quick solutions. Now, let's talk about the military dimension. Because this is where things get dangerous. The US response to Venezuela's move has been to flex its military muscle. The Southern Command has conducted joint exercises with Guyana, deployed naval assets to the region, and even flown B-52 bombers over the Caribbean in a show of force. The message is the US will not tolerate a Venezuelan invasion of the Essequibo. But here's the military deterrence is only effective if the other side believes you're willing to use force. And Maduro has good reason to doubt that. Let me tell you something I've learned from decades of studying military: the US is very good at starting wars. It's much less good at winning them. And it's terrible at knowing when to stop. Look at the last 20 years. The US invaded Iraq in 2003 with the goal of toppling Saddam Hussein and establishing a stable democracy. 20 years later, Iraq is a fractured, unstable state, Iran's influence in the region has grown, and the US has spent trillions of dollars with little to show for it. In Afghanistan, the US spent 2 decades propping up a corrupt government, only to see the Taliban retake control in a matter of weeks. In Libya, the US and its allies toppled Gaddafi, only to plunge the country into chaos and create a haven for jihadist groups. The lesson here is military force is a blunt instrument. It can achieve short-term objectives, but it rarely produces lasting solutions. And in the case of Venezuela, the risks of intervention far outweigh the potential benefits. First, there's the question of capability. Venezuela's military is a shadow of what it once was. The country's economic collapse has hollowed out its armed forces. Equipment is outdated and poorly maintained. Morale is low. And the regime's reliance on Cuban and Russian advisors suggests that it lacks confidence in its own military leadership. But that doesn't mean Venezuela is defenseless. The country has a large stockpile of Russian-made air defense systems, including S-300s, which could pose a serious threat to U.S. aircraft. It also has a network of irregular forces, including colectivos and foreign mercenaries, that could wage a protracted insurgency in the event of an invasion. Second, there's the question of escalation. Venezuela is not Iraq or Afghanistan. It's a country with deep historical ties to Russia and China. Both countries have invested heavily in Venezuela's oil sector, and both have provided military support to the regime. If the U.S. were to launch a military strike against Venezuela, it would risk provoking a response from Moscow or Beijing. Russia has already warned that it would view any attack on Venezuela as a threat to its interests. And China, while more cautious, has made it clear that it opposes any foreign intervention in the region. Third, there's the question of regional support. The U.S. would need the backing of its Latin American allies to legitimize any military action. But that support is far from guaranteed. Brazil, the region's largest country, has already signaled that it opposes any military solution to the crisis. Mexico, under President López Obrador, has taken a similarly cautious stance. And even Colombia, which has historically been a close U.S. ally, has urged restraint without regional support. Any U.S. intervention would be seen as a unilateral act of aggression, further undermining American credibility. Finally, there's the question of domestic politics. The U.S. is entering an election year, and the Biden administration is already facing criticism from both the left and the right. The left opposes any military intervention on principle. The right, meanwhile, is divided between those who want a more aggressive stance against Venezuela and those who believe the U.S. should focus on domestic issues. In this environment, any military action would be politically risky. So what's the alternative? The U.S. could continue to rely on sanctions and diplomatic pressure. But sanctions have failed to topple the Maduro regime, and they've only deepened Venezuela's economic crisis, fueling mass migration and regional instability. Diplomatic pressure, meanwhile, has been ineffective, as Venezuela has shown little interest in negotiating a settlement. This is the dilemma facing the U.S., it has few good options. Military intervention is too risky. Sanctions have failed. And diplomacy has gone nowhere. Which leaves the U.S. in a position of strategic paralysis, able to deter a full-scale invasion, but unable to force a resolution to the crisis. And that's exactly where Maduro wants the U.S. to be. The domestic political why this matters in Washington. Now, let's talk about the domestic politics of this crisis, because that's where things get really interesting. The Biden administration's response to Venezuela's move has been shaped by three key domestic: the 2024 election, the Democratic Party's internal divisions, and the influence of key interest groups. First, the election. Biden is facing a tough re-election campaign, and his foreign policy record is a major vulnerability. The chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan, the ongoing war in Ukraine, and the escalating tensions with China have all fueled perceptions of weakness. And in an election where immigration and border security are top issues, the administration can't afford to be seen as soft on Venezuela, a country that has sent hundreds of thousands of migrants to the U.S. in recent years. This is why the administration has taken a tough rhetorical stance on Venezuela. But it's also why it's been careful to avoid any action that could escalate into a full-blown crisis. The last thing Biden needs is another foreign policy quagmire in an election year. Second, the Democratic parties. Internal divisions are playing a major role here, and they're not the ones you might expect. It's not just the progressive wing pushing for a softer line, though figures like Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez have criticized sanctions as counterproductive. The real fracture is within the establishment itself, between the old guard of the Obama-era foreign policy team and a newer generation of advisors who see Latin America through a different lens. Take Juan Gonzalez, the National Security Council's senior director for the Western Hemisphere. He's a veteran of the Obama administration, but he's also someone who understands the limits of U.S. leverage in the region. Then you have figures like Samantha Power, the USAID administrator, who has been vocal about the humanitarian consequences of sanctions but stopped short of advocating for their removal. This tension isn't just academic, it's shaping policy in real time. When the Biden administration partially eased sanctions on Venezuela's oil sector in October 2023, it wasn't because they suddenly believed in Maduro's goodwill. It was because they were caught between two bad: either double down on a failing strategy or make a calculated gamble that limited engagement might yield better results than isolation. The problem? Neither side of this debate has a convincing answer for what comes in. Now, what most people don't realize is how much this internal democratic divide mirrors the broader crisis of U.S. foreign policy in the 21st century. Since the end of the Cold War, Washington has oscillated between two: either overreach, as we saw in Iraq and Libya, or strategic drift, as we've seen in Syria and now Venezuela. The Obama administration tried to thread the needle with its light footprint approach, using drones, sanctions, and proxy forces to avoid large-scale interventions. But that strategy has its own flaws, particularly when it comes to Latin America. The region isn't the Middle East. It doesn't have the same geopolitical weight, and it doesn't command the same level of public attention. That means the U.S. can afford to be inconsistent in ways it can't elsewhere. One day, the administration is imposing new sanctions; the next, it's quietly negotiating with Maduro's envoys. One week, it's condemning Venezuela's election as a sham; the next, it's sending a delegation to Caracas to discuss energy cooperation. This kind of policy whiplash might make sense in the short term, but it erodes U.S. credibility over time. And in a region where China and Russia are actively extending their influence, credibility isn't just a nice-to-have, it's a strategic asset. Let me explain why this matters beyond Venezuela's borders. What's happening in Caracas isn't just about one country's descent into authoritarianism. It's a test case for how the U.S. adapts to a world where its unipolar moment is over. For decades, Washington operated under the assumption that it could shape Latin America's political and economic trajectory through a mix of coercion and persuasion. The Monroe Doctrine, the Alliance for Progress, the war on drugs, these were all expressions of that belief. But today, that assumption is being challenged on multiple fronts. China has become the largest trading partner for most of South America, investing billions in infrastructure and energy projects. Russia, meanwhile, has positioned itself as a security partner for regimes that feel threatened by U.S. pressure, from Nicaragua to Bolivia. And then there's the rise of regional blocs like the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States, which explicitly exclude the U.S. and Canada. These aren't just symbolic gestures. They represent a fundamental shift in how Latin American countries see their place in the world and how little they need Washington's approval to chart their own course. Here's the uncomfortable: Venezuela's defiance isn't an anomaly. It's a preview of what's to come. The U.S. is no longer the only game in town, and countries like Venezuela are learning how to play the great powers off each other. Maduro's regime has mastered this game. It takes money from China, arms from Russia, and oil deals from Iran, all while keeping the U.S. guessing about its next move. And it does this without ever fully committing to any one patron. That's the real genius of Venezuela's strategy: it's not about choosing sides. It's about exploiting the competition between them. The U.S. sanctions Venezuela, so China steps in with loans. The U.S. pressures the UN to condemn Maduro, so Russia vetoes the resolution. The U.S. threatens military action, so Iran sends warships to the Caribbean. This isn't just about survival. It's about leverage. And it's working. Now, let's talk about the military implications, because this is where things get really dangerous. The U.S. has spent decades treating Latin America as its backyard, a region where it could project power with minimal resistance. But that assumption is being tested in ways that should make policymakers in Washington very nervous. Venezuela's recent military exercises, particularly the ones involving Russian and Iranian assets, weren't just posturing. They were a demonstration of how quickly the balance of power in the region could shift. Consider the facts. In June 2023, Venezuela and Russia conducted joint naval exercises in the Caribbean, the first of their kind in years. In September, Iran sent 2 warships to Venezuelan waters, a move that prompted the U.S. to deploy additional assets to the region. And in December, Venezuela announced the creation of a new strategic command to oversee its military operations, a clear signal that it's preparing for a more assertive posture. What does this mean in practical terms? It means that the U.S. can no longer assume it has unchallenged dominance in its own hemisphere. The days when the U.S. could blockade Cuba or invade AMA with impunity are over. Today, any military action against Venezuela would risk triggering a wider conflict with unpredictable consequences. Imagine, for a moment, that the U.S. decides to enforce a naval blockade to stop Iranian oil shipments to Venezuela. What happens when Iranian or Russian vessels refuse to comply? What happens if Venezuela responds by seizing a U.S. oil rig in the Gulf of Mexico? These aren't hypothetical scenarios. They're the kind of escalatory dynamics that keep military planners up at night. And the problem is, the U.S. doesn't have a good answer for how to de-escalate once the shooting starts. This brings me to the most overlooked aspect of this: the role of non-state actors. When we talk about Venezuela's military posture, we tend to focus on its conventional forces, the Russian-made Sukhoi jets, the Iranian drones, the Chinese radar systems. But the real wildcard here is Venezuela's network of paramilitary groups and criminal organizations. The colectivos, the Bolivarian militias, the drug cartels that operate with impunity in the border regions, these are the forces that would make any U.S. intervention a nightmare. The U.S. learned this lesson the hard way in Iraq and Afghanistan, where insurgencies turned what were supposed to be quick victories into decade-long quagmires. Venezuela would be no different. The country's terrain, dense jungles, sprawling urban slums, porous borders, is tailor-made for asymmetric warfare. And Maduro's regime has spent years cultivating these groups, arming them, and integrating them into its security apparatus. If the U.S. ever did decide to intervene, it wouldn't just be fighting the Venezuelan military. It would be fighting an entire ecosystem of armed actors with deep local knowledge and no interest in playing by the rules of conventional warfare. So where does this leave us? The U.S. is stuck in a strategic bind, and the options are all bad. Military intervention is off the table. Sanctions have failed. Diplomacy has gone nowhere. And the longer this stalemate drags on, the more space it creates for other players to reshape the region's geopolitical landscape. China is already positioning itself as the alternative to U.S. hegemony, offering loans and infrastructure projects without the political strings attached. Russia is using Venezuela as a testing ground for its hybrid warfare tactics, from disinformation campaigns to cyber attacks. And Iran is exploiting the crisis to extend its influence in the Western Hemisphere, turning Venezuela into a hub for its proxy networks. The real question isn't whether the U.S. can force regime change in Venezuela. It's whether the U.S. can adapt to a world where it no longer calls all the shots. For decades, Washington has operated under the assumption that it could contain crises like Venezuela through a mix of pressure and neglect. But that strategy is no longer sustainable. The region is changing, and the U.S. is running out of time to decide how it wants to engage with it. Does it double down on a failed policy of isolation? Does it try to outmaneuver China and Russia by offering a more attractive alternative? Or does it accept that its influence in Latin America is waning and focus on managing the fallout? Here's the: none of these options are particularly appealing. But the longer the U.S. waits to make a choice, the worse the consequences will be. Venezuela isn't just a problem to be solved. It's a symptom of a much larger shift in global power dynamics. And if the U.S. doesn't start treating it that way, it's going to find itself playing catch-up in a region it once dominated. That's the real recalculation that's needed, not just in Caracas, but in Washington. And so far, there's little sign that anyone in power is ready to make it. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just about Venezuela, it's about the unraveling of an entire regional order that the U.S. has taken for granted since the Monroe Doctrine. For over 2 centuries, Washington has treated Latin America as its backyard, a sphere of influence where it could intervene at will, prop up dictators when convenient, and ignore democratic backsliding when it suited its interests. The problem? That order was never as stable as it seemed. It was always propped up by a combination of economic dependency, military coercion, and the absence of serious competitors. But now, all three of those pillars are crumbling. Let me explain why this matters. The US has spent the last 3 decades assuming that its dominance in Latin America was a permanent feature of the global landscape, like the tides or the rotation of the Earth. But history doesn't work that way. Empires don't decline because they lose a single battle, they decline because they stop adapting. And right now, Washington is stuck in a 20th century mindset, trying to apply Cold War tactics to a 21st century world where the rules have changed. Take the sanctions regime, for example. The US has imposed over 900 sanctions on Venezuela since 2017, targeting everything from oil exports to gold mining to the country's cryptocurrency operations. And what has it achieved? The Venezuelan economy is still standing, albeit on its knees, while China and Russia have stepped in to fill the void. In 2023 alone, China imported over 400,000 barrels of Venezuelan oil per day, despite US sanctions, while Russia has provided everything from military advisors to cybersecurity support. The uncomfortable truth is that sanctions don't work when other great powers are willing to ignore them. And right now, Beijing and Moscow are treating Venezuela as a laboratory for their own economic and military strategies, a place to test how far they can push back against US hegemony without triggering a direct confrontation. Here's where the grand strategy question gets really uncomfortable. The US has 3 broad options, none of them good. The first is to double down on the current: more sanctions, more diplomatic isolation, more rhetoric about democracy and human rights. But this is the definition of insanity, doing the same thing and expecting a different result. The second option is to try to outmaneuver China and Russia by offering a more attractive economic alternative. This would mean something radical, like a new Marshall Plan for Latin America, with massive infrastructure investments, debt relief, and trade deals that actually benefit the region rather than just US corporations. But there's zero political appetite for that in Washington. The third option is the most, except that US influence in Latin America is waning and focus on damage control. That would mean treating Venezuela not as a rogue state to be punished, but as a geopolitical reality to be managed, engaging with Maduro when necessary, containing the spillover effects of the crisis, and preventing the region from becoming a permanent battleground for great power competition. None of these options are particularly appealing, but the status quo is unsustainable. The longer the US clings to its failed policies, the more it risks repeating the mistakes of the past. Remember the Bay of Pigs? The Iran-Contra affair? The disastrous interventions in Central America during the Cold War? Each of those was a miscalculation born out of the same hubris, the belief that the US could shake the region and its image without consequences. And each time, the blowback was worse than the original problem. Now, I'm not suggesting that the US should abandon its values or turn a blind eye to human rights abuses. But there's a difference between standing up for democracy and pretending that regime change is still a viable option in 2024. The world has changed, and the US needs to change with it. That means accepting that Venezuela is no longer a client state to be bullied into submission, but a sovereign nation that will make its own alliances, however distasteful they may be to Washington. The real recalculation isn't just about Venezuela, it's about the future of US power in the Western Hemisphere. And right now, the signs aren't encouraging. The Biden administration has been just as rigid as the Trump administration when it comes to Venezuela, clinging to the fiction that Juan Guaidó is still the legitimate president despite the fact that he hasn't set foot in the country in years. Meanwhile, the rest of the region is moving on. Mexico, Brazil, and Argentina have all signaled that they're ready to re-engage with Caracas, not out of love for Maduro, but because they recognize that isolation isn't working. Even Colombia, which has been one of the US's closest allies in the region, has reopened its border with Venezuela and resumed diplomatic relations. So where does that leave us? The US is facing it can either adapt to this new reality or watch as its influence in Latin America erodes further. And if history is any guide, it's going to take a crisis, maybe a migration surge, maybe a military provocation, maybe a full-blown economic collapse to force Washington to act. But by then, it might be too late. The window for a graceful retreat is closing, and the longer the US waits, the more it risks being dragged into a conflict it can't win. Here's the bottom: Venezuela isn't just a problem to be solved. It's a test case for how the US will navigate a world where its power is no longer absolute. And so far, it's failing that test. The question isn't whether the US can force Maduro out, it's whether it can accept a world where it no longer gets to decide who rules in Caracas. That's the real recalculation. And if Washington doesn't start making it soon, the consequences won't just be felt in Venezuela. They'll be felt across the entire hemisphere.